At the beginning, it rarely feels like manipulation. It feels like destiny. The charm is effortless, the attention is intense, and the emotional connection seems unusually fast and deep. You feel seen, admired, even elevated in her presence. From a psychological standpoint, this is not accidental. Carl Jung spoke about the persona, the mask we present to the world, and in women with strong narcissistic traits, this mask is often polished to perfection. What you encounter is not the full personality, but a carefully constructed image designed to evoke admiration and attachment. This charm works because it mirrors your unmet needs. She reflects back your values, your dreams, your emotional language. It creates the illusion of rare compatibility. Yet true intimacy unfolds gradually. It tolerates imperfection, disagreement, and emotional pauses. Here, everything feels accelerated, almost theatrical. The intensity itself becomes the proof of love, when in reality, it is the mechanism of control. Jung would describe this as projection. You are not falling in love with who she is, but with what she allows you to see, and what you unconsciously project onto her. Over time, subtle shifts appear. The warmth becomes conditional. Approval must be earned. The same charm that once drew you in begins to feel performative, even strategic. When admiration flows freely, she glows. When it slows, she withdraws. This reveals the core issue. The charm was never meant to build a shared inner world, but to secure validation and power. You were not chosen as a partner, but as an audience. Psychologically, this creates confusion because the mind clings to the memory of the perfect beginning. You keep chasing the version of her that existed when you were fully useful to her self-image. But that version was never stable because it was never real. It was a role. The moment you understand this, the spell weakens. Charm loses its authority when you see it as a mask rather than a miracle. And when illusion dissolves, clarity begins, because the most dangerous deceptions are not the ones that lie to you, but the ones that make you lie to yourself. After the charm has drawn you in, another pattern quietly takes center stage. The unrelenting need for validation. At first, it appears harmless, even human. Everyone enjoys appreciation. But here, validation is not nourishment, it is oxygen. Compliments do not settle into the psyche, they evaporate, requiring constant replenishment. Carl Jung understood this as a fragile ego structure, one that depends on external mirrors to maintain a sense of self. Without reflection from others, the inner image begins to collapse. You may notice how conversations subtly orbit around her, her achievements, her struggles, her emotions. Your role slowly shifts from partner to provider of affirmation. When attention flows, the atmosphere remains pleasant. When it fades, tension emerges. Silence, irritability, or emotional withdrawal appear, not as communication, but as pressure. This is not a request for connection. It is a demand for reassurance. In modern life, this hunger often extends into public spaces. Social media becomes a stage, and admiration from strangers becomes just as important as intimacy at home. The relationship no longer feels private or sacred. It feels competitive. You begin to sense that you are being compared, not to improve the bond, but to measure your usefulness. Validation becomes currency, and you are expected to pay regularly to keep emotional peace. Psychologically, this dynamic drains the partner because it inverts the natural flow of love. Healthy relationships involve mutual recognition, two individuals strengthening each other's inner stability. Here, one person is propping up the other's self-worth, while their own emotional needs go unnoticed. Over time, you may feel strangely invisible, despite giving so much attention. This is not neglect by accident. It is the consequence of an ego that cannot see beyond its own reflection. The most revealing moment arrives when you stop supplying constant affirmation. The reaction is rarely calm. Confusion turns into irritation, then blame, not because you have done something wrong, but because the mirror has gone dark. And this is the realization that changes everything. when someone needs your admiration more than your presence. They are not seeking love. They are seeking survival. As the need for validation intensifies, emotional manipulation often enters quietly, wearing the disguise of sensitivity. She may describe herself as deeply feeling, easily hurt, or profoundly misunderstood. On the surface, this appears vulnerable, even admirable. But Jung would remind us that not all emotion is a doorway to truth. Sometimes it is a strategy of the unconscious to protect the ego from exposure. Here, emotion is not used to connect, but to control the emotional field of the relationship. You begin to notice that difficult conversations never stay focused. When you express discomfort or set a boundary, the discussion quickly shifts to her pain, her trauma, her exhaustion. Your concern is reframed as cruelty. Your boundary becomes an attack. This is not coincidence, it is emotional inversion. Responsibility is quietly transferred from her behavior to your reaction, leaving you apologizing for feelings that were never wrong to have. This manipulation is especially powerful because it operates through guilt rather than force. You hesitate to speak honestly because you do not want to hurt her. Over time, you censor yourself, choosing silence over conflict. Jung described this as the domination of the emotional complex, where unresolved inner wounds hijack present relationships. Her suffering may be real, but it is weaponized, used to silence accountability and maintain psychological superiority. Another subtle sign appears in how empathy flows only in one direction. When she is distressed, the world must pause. When you are struggling, the response is minimal, distracted, or quickly redirected back to her experience. Emotional depth becomes selective. Sensitivity exists, but only when it serves the self-image of being fragile, special, or morally superior. The result is a slow erosion of your inner authority. You begin to doubt your perceptions. You wonder if you are too harsh, too demanding, too insensitive. This self-doubt is not accidental. It is the byproduct of prolonged emotional manipulation framed as vulnerability. The turning point comes when you recognize the difference between shared pain and strategic pain. One invites closeness. The other enforces silence. And once I see that emotional sensitivity is being used as leverage rather than truth, you regain something essential: the right to trust your own inner voice after prolonged exposure to manipulation disguised as emotion. A deeper absence becomes impossible to ignore: the lack of genuine empathy. At first it is subtle. She may say the right words, mirror concern, or offer surface-level comfort. Yet when your needs require real emotional presence or inconvenience her self-image, the response thins out. Carl Jung viewed empathy as an expression of individuation, the capacity to step outside the ego and truly encounter another psyche. Where narcissistic traits dominate, this capacity is imitated rather than lived. You may notice that your pain is acknowledged only insofar as it can be managed quickly or reframed. If your struggle cannot be fixed, admired, or redirected toward her narrative, it becomes uncomfortable. She listens, but only halfway. The moment your vulnerability challenges her sense of importance or moral superiority, patience fades. Compassion turns conditional. Over time, this creates a strange loneliness within the relationship. You are physically present, emotionally invested, yet inwardly alone. Your experiences are minimized, rationalized, or subtly blamed on your sensitivity. Jung would describe this as a failure of psychological relatedness, two bodies in proximity, but only one psyche being honored. The other exists primarily as a function, not a subject. This absence of empathy often becomes most visible during moments of genuine need. Illness, grief, stress, or emotional exhaustion expose the truth. Instead of support, you may encounter irritation, distinct or even resentment, as though your suffering is an interruption. When empathy is real, another's pain deepens connection. When it is missing, pain becomes an inconvenience. Psychologically, this dynamic reshapes your self-concept. You begin to feel that needing support is weakness. You hesitate to share. You carry your burdens alone while continuing to carry hers. This imbalance is not love, it is emotional asymmetry. And asymmetry, left unchallenged, quietly erodes dignity. The most sobering realization is this: empathy cannot be negotiated or taught through sacrifice. It either exists as a living capacity, or it does not. And when you finally accept that someone can understand your words but not your inner world, you gain the clarity to stop asking for what they were never equipped to give. As empathy fades, control quietly takes its place, not through overt domination, but through subtle psychological tactics that keep the balance of power tilted. One of the most common is withdrawal, emotional distance used not for reflection, but for punishment. Silence appears suddenly, not as a pause for understanding, but as a message: affection is conditional. Carl Jung understood power in relationships as deeply tied to unconscious fear. And here, fear becomes the invisible hand guiding behavior. You may notice how communication is replaced by absence. Messages go unanswered. Warmth turns cold without explanation. When closeness is restored, it often comes without resolution, teaching you an unspoken lesson: do not question, do not confront, do not disrupt the emotional order. This is not maturity, it is conditioning. The nervous system learns to associate peace with compliance. Another method of control emerges through comparison. Casual remarks about past partners, admirers, or people who understand her better are introduced, often framed as honesty or harmless conversation. But psychologically, this creates insecurity. You are subtly reminded that your position is replaceable, that approval must be earned and maintained. Jung would recognize this as an activation of the inferiority complex, where self-worth is destabilized to ensure dependence. Over time, these tactics reshape your behavior. You become hyper-aware of tone, timing, and expression. You try to anticipate emotional shifts to avoid withdrawal or conflict. In doing so, you slowly abandon authenticity. Control has succeeded when you begin to manage yourself more than the relationship itself. What makes this particularly effective is its deniability. When confronted, she may accuse you of being sensitive, paranoid, or controlling. The manipulation remains hidden behind plausible explanations, yet your body knows the truth. Anxiety, self-doubt, and emotional fatigue become constant companions. The philosophical danger here is not simply control, but erosion of the self. Jung warned that prolonged exposure to unconscious dynamics leads to possession, where one psyche begins to dominate another. You lose clarity not because you are weak, but because you are adapting to survive. The moment you recognize that love should not feel like walking on emotional glass, something shifts. Control loses power when awareness replaces fear. And once you stop negotiating for basic respect, you begin the quiet but radical act of reclaiming yourself. When control begins to fail, a final turn reveals itself: the fear of exposure and the panic that follows the loss of power. This is the moment when the entire structure becomes visible. Carl Jung often spoke of what happens when the ego is threatened by consciousness. The shadow reacts. In women with strong narcissistic traits, this reaction is not quiet. It is urgent, emotional, and often extreme. You may notice a sudden shift when you stop chasing, stop explaining, or stop reacting. Boundaries that once seemed impossible now feel necessary, and the response to this change is rarely respectful. What appears instead is volatility, anger, accusations, dramatic victimhood, or an abrupt surge of affection meant to pull you back into the old dynamic. This is not reconciliation, it is recovery of control. The persona cracks because the audience has gone silent. Psychologically, this panic stems from a fragile inner structure. Without external regulation, your attention, your emotional energy, the self-image begins to destabilize. Jung would say the ego, unable to integrate its shadow, lashes out to avoid collapse. This explains the sudden rewriting of history, the distortion of facts, and the projection of blame. You are no longer a partner, you become a threat. This phase is especially dangerous because it tests your resolve. The intensity can feel confusing, even seductive. You may briefly see the warmth you once believed in, making you question your decision. But this warmth is conditional and temporary. It exists only to restore the previous imbalance. Once control is regained, the cycle quietly resumes. The deeper realization comes when you understand that the panic is not about losing you, it is about low C, NG authority over you. Love grieves. Control panics. One seeks understanding, the other demands compliance. From a philosophical perspective, this is the point of individuation for you. You are confronted with a choice: return to the comfort of illusion or tolerate the discomfort of truth. Growth, as Jung taught, is never painless, but it is always liberating. And when you choose clarity over chaos, you step out of the role you were assigned and into the person you were meant to become, free, grounded, and no longer controlled by someone else's fear of being seen,